And how long has the study of these forces been researched?
Yeah, well, at least back to the early 60s. In 1961 and 62, there was a lot of testing done by the U.S. and Russia. U.S. had something called Operation Fishbowl, where my understanding of it, they were detonating high altitude nuclear weapons, right? So they're detonating warheads. They were really looking to see if that was going to be a protection mechanism against incoming missiles. Could they disable incoming missiles with an EMP, which makes sense, right? And they had some unintentional side effects, things like Starfish Prime, where they detonated over the Pacific Ocean and they saw hundreds of miles away damage to electronic systems on the ground. And then they realized, oh wow, these EMP waves are really powerful. Maybe this could be an offensive weapon as well as a defensive weapon. And that's kind of where it's gone now. Every time you hear EMP nowadays, you're usually talking about an offensive weapon, something to destroy something, like a military base or even communication systems or whatever. So they've been around since the 60s, and Russia did something similar right around the same time, 61, 62. They detonated multiple warheads over Kazakhstan, which was a populated area, but they were up high, from tens to hundreds of kilometers, and they detonated just to see what would happen. Now keep in mind, the 1960s electrical power system was very different than ours today, right? And things have modernized, and yet they still did see some fires and some damage to these power plants and things like that. So the conclusion was, hey, this is a viable strategic weapon we could use. And today people feel like we're much more vulnerable because we have a lot of these what are called SCADAs, but they're these controllers that control everything, the switching of things and the distribution. And those things have been shown to be susceptible, particularly susceptible to an EMP. And so people think, yeah, that's probably where the enemy would go after, is they detonate over the central U.S. or over maybe one of the seaboards, and hopefully take out the grid, the interconnection systems, which could disrupt lots of things in the U.S. for a long period of time. And likewise, we have the same ideas of, if we had to attack Iran or Russia or China, I'm sure we have people planning where would we detonate things to cause a mass disruption of their military operations and things like that. So that's
So,
kind of what I know.
one analogy that I like to think about it, if because I feel like I understand E1, E2, E3 to a degree, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but a good analogy would be for it is if you were to throw a rock into a pond, and that first initial splash would be that E1, and then the ripples of that splash would be E2, and then the water hitting the shore and then reverberating back in where you can see ripples throughout the entire pond would be the E3. Would that be somewhat of a summary of the
That
effect?
seems like a reasonable analogy, sure. I tend to think of it in terms of like time duration, and that's kind of similar to what you're saying. Something occurs very quickly and then it's over. And then something kind of takes some time to occur, that's the E2. And then there's this long-term slow growing effect, which is the E3. So yeah, it seems
Which
reasonable.
E3 can be anywhere between what, 6 to 8 hours, something like that, that the atmosphere is
Yeah, usually
disturbed.
they say minutes to hours, but whether it's 5 minutes or an hour probably doesn't make a lot of difference. It's long enough that if you had protection mechanisms, you could switch them in. Unlike really even E1 or E2, E1's over in nanoseconds, 20 nanoseconds or something. So you're not going to do anything physical in that time. E2, yes, you can shunt energy away like we do with transient surge protectors and stuff. But that's a well-known, not a physical movement, but an electrical diversion tactic, right? And then E3, you actually have time to physically open switches and move things, right? And disconnect from grids and things like that. So different protection methods.